is advised.
I would never beat that girl. Never. She was beat up on by other girls. In fact, my own daughter stopped doing her job, broke her wrist.
All I did was write that thing on her stomach, then I hit her about 10 or 15 times.
How come?
Well, mostly because Gertie told me to.
How about the inscription on there, I am a prostitute and proud of it? Who put that on?
I did.
Did you scratch it on there, paint it on there? How'd you do it?
Well, like I said before, Gertie wrote it down there with a pen, and I did the rest.
Gertrude Baniszewski, also known as Gertrude Wright and the torture mother, was an Indiana divorcee who oversaw and was responsible for the prolonged torture, mutilation, and eventual murder of Sylvia Likens, a teenage girl she had taken into her home. The case is unique. Although she did play an active role in Sylvia Likens' death, the majority of the torture that brought about Sylvia's death was carried out by her teenage children and other neighborhood children. Although Baniszewski did instruct the children on several occasions, it was later discovered that they took a large degree of Sylvia's torture into their own hands. What would later be called Lord of the Flies scenario come to life. When she was convicted of first-degree murder in 1965, the case was called the single worst crime against an individual in Indiana's history. Gertrude Van Fossen was born in 1929, the third of 6 children. She was close to her father and hated her mother. In 1940, the 11-year-old Gertrude watched her father die of a sudden heart attack. 5 years later, she dropped out of school at the age of 16 to marry 18-year-old Deputy John Baniszewski, by whom she had 4 children. John had a bad temper and would often beat his wife for annoying him. The two stayed together for 10 years before eventually divorcing. Gertrude was granted custody of the children. Within a year of divorce, she met and married a man named Edward Guthrie, who divorced her after 3 months when he got sick and tired of having her children around. Shortly thereafter, Gertrude and John reconciled and remarried. The couple stayed together for 7 years and had 2 more children. They finally divorced permanently in 1963. Around this time, Gertrude was 37 years old when she began having an affair with a 23-year-old named Dennis Lee Wright, who further abused her. She became pregnant by him twice, suffered 1 miscarriage after a beating, and given birth to 1 child. This child, Dennis Jr., would be Gertrude's last child. In all, she had 7 children and suffered 6 miscarriages. Shortly after Dennis Jr.'s birth, Dennis Wright Sr. abandoned Gertrude and disappeared. She was left essentially destitute, as Wright had been supporting her financially. She was now forced to support herself and 7 children on occasional child support payments from the unreliable John Baniszewski. She performed odd jobs around town, such as babysitting, doing other people's laundry for them. Financial problems quickly mounted when her 17-year-old daughter, Paula, became pregnant after a fling with a middle-aged married man. Around this time, Gertrude's health declined considerably. She was chronically ill with a number of unidentified illnesses, ceased practicing proper hygiene, and barely ate. These factors began to affect her outward appearance, resulting in a receded hairline, sunken eyes, and overall skeletal appearance. Gertrude began to present herself as Miss Wright, claiming that she had in fact married Dennis before he abandoned her, which allowed her to keep up a veneer of respectability. In July 1965, Paula Baniszewski met up with a friend of hers, Darlene McGuire, who introduced her to 2 neighborhood girls, Sylvia Marie Likens, 16, and Sylvia's younger sister, Jenny, 15, who was required to walk with braces due to polio. Paula took the girls back home to 3850 East New York Street, where they drank soda and listened to records. Sylvia's mother, Betty, was in jail for shoplifting, leaving her to care for her sister. Betty had abandoned Sylvia's father, Lester, and basically had kidnapped their 2 daughters. When Paula heard of the girls' circumstances, she offered to let Sylvia and Jenny spend the night. Next day, Lester Likens arrived in town and tracked down his wife. He then ran into Darlene McGuire, who recognized the description he gave of his daughters, and she directed him to the Baniszewski home. When Lester Likens arrived, Gertrude Baniszewski introduced herself as Miss Wright, and the girls were happy to see their father. The 2 parents struck up a conversation. Lester Likens explained that he and his wife were carnies and didn't want their daughters to fall behind in school while traveling from carnival to carnival with their parents. So Lester asked if his daughters could stay at her house. Needing the money, Gertrude said yes. They both agreed to that she would take care of the girls for $20 a week. Lester Likens should have inspected the house before leaving. Gertrude's home had no stove or microwave, only enough beds for half the people in the house. The only thing to eat was bread and crackers. The whole house was caked with thick layers of dirt, and only enough plates and utensils for 3 people. The first week of Sylvia and Jenny's lives at the Baniszewski home went well. They attended high school and attended teenage social functions with the Baniszewski children, as well as church with Gertrude on Sunday. When Lester's $20 payment failed to arrive, though, Gertrude threw a temper tantrum, screaming at the girls, "I took care of you 2 bitches for nothing," before forcing them to lie across the bed with their skirts and underwear around their ankles while she beat their buttocks. Shortly thereafter, Lester and Betty Likens came into town to check on the girls. Neither of them made any reference to the beatings, presumably under threat from Baniszewski. The next week, Sylvia and Jenny went through the neighborhood garbage, collecting old Coca-Cola bottles to sell in order to get money for candy. When they came home with the candy, Gertrude accused them of stealing. When Sylvia explained how she had gotten the candy, Baniszewski accused her of lying and made her bend over the bed as before, while she beat her across the buttocks with a paddle. After a church social a few days later, Sylvia pigged out on food there, and the Baniszewski children told their mother. Gertrude told Sylvia that she was angry that she would do something to ruin her physical appearance, and forced Sylvia to eat a hot dog pile of condiments. When Sylvia vomited, Baniszewski forced her to scoop the vomit up and eat it. Soon afterwards, Lester and Betty Likens came into town again to check on the girls. Gertrude told Sylvia not to mention the vomit-eating incident. The incident which triggered the sharp decline of Gertrude Baniszewski's mental stability occurred in August of 1965, when she overheard Sylvia remark that she had once allowed a boy to fill her up. Gertrude inexplicably burst into a fit of obscenities, accused Sylvia of being a prostitute, and informed the rest of the house that Sylvia was pregnant because she let a boy touch her vagina. Gertrude then attacked Sylvia, repeatedly kicking her in the crotch. When Sylvia attempted to sit down afterwards, Paula threw out of the chair and informed her, "You ain't fit to sit in chairs." From then on, Gertrude only allowed Sylvia to sit in a chair with permission. Around this time, she also began allowing her older children to use Sylvia as a living plaything, with games ranging from beatings to being pushed down the stairs. Why Sylvia's story so enraged Gertrude is still unclear to this day. Was it because she saw in Sylvia the beauty and opportunity for happiness that had long escaped her? Or was it her hard life and current living conditions that caused a mental break? Others have theorized that the violence against Sylvia was an extreme form of domestic abuse, which Gertrude directed her rage into Sylvia. Whatever the case, Gertrude manifested this rage by justifying her attacks by accusing Sylvia Likens of being a prostitute. She began to deliver bizarre sermons to her children and Sylvia about the filthiness of prostitutes and women in general. The day after Gertrude kicked Sylvia in the crotch, Sylvia and Jenny decided to get revenge and told their classmates that they had seen Paula and her sister Stephanie having sex with boys in exchange for money. When Stephanie's 15-year-old boyfriend, Coy Hubbard, discovered what Sylvia and Jenny had said, he came to the Baniszewski home and beat Sylvia. From then on, Hubbard, encouraged by Gertrude, made frequent visits to the home, where she would instruct the boy to practice his judo on Sylvia. Also around this time, Gertrude got Sylvia's best friend, a 13-year-old named Anna Cisco, alone long enough to convince her that Sylvia had been telling boys at school that Anna's mother was a whore. When Gertrude took Anna to see Sylvia, she directed Anna in a violent attack on the girl. Soon after, Baniszewski told one of Paula's friends, a girl named Judy Duke, that Sylvia had been spreading rumors about her mother and pitted the girls against each other in a fist fight. During the fight, Baniszewski instructed Jenny to punch Sylvia. When Jenny refused, Gertrude began to beat her in the face with her fists until Jenny finally agreed to punch Sylvia. Sylvia came home from school and told Gertrude that she needed a sweatsuit for gym class. She told Sylvia that she could not afford one, so Sylvia stole one from school. She questioned Sylvia about her new gym outfit, eventually getting Sylvia to confess. Gertrude somehow went from the topic of stealing into the topic of Sylvia being a prostitute, and threw Sylvia onto the ground where she repeatedly kicked her in the crotch, before once more returning to the topic of theft. To cure Sylvia of her sticky fingers, Baniszewski burned the tips of each of Sylvia's fingers with a lit cigarette. Afterwards, she made Sylvia bend over her while she whipped her with a belt. After this incident, the smokers in the Baniszewski home began putting their cigarettes out on Sylvia's body, as a reminder for her not to steal. Sometime later, Sylvia went out again to sell old soda bottles for money. When she returned home, Gertrude accused her of prostitution. She took her into the living room and forced her to strip naked in front of her sons and several neighborhood boys, after threatening to beat Jenny if she didn't. Once Sylvia was fully naked, Gertrude handed her a glass Coca-Cola bottle and forced Sylvia to masturbate with it in front of the boys. Following the Coke bottle incident, Sylvia became incontinent. As a result, Gertrude decided that she was no longer fit to live with the humans and locked her in the basement. The lack of toilet in the basement forced Sylvia to defecate and urinate on the floor. When Gertrude saw this, she began a bathing ritual to clean Sylvia, who she now called the dirty girl. The ritual consisted of filling the bathtub with scalding water, binding Sylvia's wrists and ankles, and then dunking her into it. The ritual was done once or twice a day, or sometimes not at all. But after the baths, Paula Baniszewski would rub handfuls of salt all over Sylvia's nude body. During this period, Gertrude took on 14-year-old Ricky Hobbs, a neighborhood boy, as her personal assistant when dealing with Sylvia. Hobbs, an honor student from a middle-class family, experienced a sudden shift in personality upon becoming Gertrude's assistant. He would blindly follow whatever order she gave him. Crime reporters have since speculated that Hobbs was Gertrude's lover and that she had seduced the boy into becoming her henchman. Baniszewski's children turned Sylvia into a money-making opportunity, charging neighborhood children a nickel to gawk at the nude Sylvia or to push her down the stairs to the basement, where she was now kept when she was not bathed or put on display. She was constantly kept naked and rarely fed. When she was allowed to eat, it was in some bizarre fashion, like eating soup with her fingers. Often Gertrude and her 12-year-old son John Jr. would make Sylvia clean the basement by making her eat her own feces, and gave Sylvia a container in which she could collect her urine, which she was then made to drink. Sometime around this period, Jenny managed to contact her older sister Diana by letter, who was married and had a family of her own. Jenny outlined the horrors they were experiencing and wanted her sister to tell police and come and rescue them. Diana ignored the letter, believing Jenny was lying. Also around this time, one of the neighborhood children who had been by to see Sylvia, a 12-year-old girl named Judy Duke, went home and told her mother they were beating and kicking Sylvia. The girl's mother replied, that was what happened when someone was punished. Shortly thereafter, the Baniszewski's Reverend, Roy Julian, visited them as part of a program he had set up to see each of his parishioners at their homes. While he and Gertrude drank coffee, she complained to him that Sylvia had been an intense burden on her, claiming that the girl was a prostitute who had been servicing married men and had gotten pregnant. Although at the time her daughter Paula was several months pregnant, Gertrude insisted that her daughter was a virgin and that Sylvia was attempting to pass off her own misdeeds onto her pure Paula. Gertrude and the Reverend prayed for Sylvia's salvation before the Reverend left. When the Reverend returned again a few weeks later, Paula told the Reverend during her prayers that she had hatred in her heart for Sylvia. Shortly after this, Diana came by to visit her sisters. Gertrude refused to allow her into the home, at first telling her that Lester had contacted her instructor not to allow Diana into the home. When Diana questioned this, Gertrude threatened to call the police and have her arrested for trespassing. Diana hid nearby the house until she spotted Jenny outside and then approached her. Jenny told her sister that she was not allowed to talk to her and then ran away. Diana contacted social services. Gertrude informed her that she had kicked Sylvia out of the house for being physically unclean and a prostitute, and that Sylvia had since run away. Gertrude then managed to get Jenny alone long enough to inform her that if she told the social worker the truth, she would join her sister naked in the basement. Jenny then told the social worker that Sylvia had indeed run away. The social worker returned to her office, where she filed a report stating that no more calls needed to be made to the Baniszewski home. On October 21st, Gertrude instructed John Jr., Coy, and Stephanie to bring Sylvia up in the basement and tie her to a bed, telling Sylvia that she could hold her bladder through the night and she could sleep upstairs again. When Gertrude checked Sylvia the next morning and discovered that she had wet the bed, she made her dress, then took her into the living room, where she was forced to perform a striptease for her sons and the neighborhood boys. She was then forced to masturbate with a Coca-Cola bottle again. After Sylvia climaxed and finished, she was allowed to dress. Gertrude then brought up Sylvia's lies about Paul and Stephanie and declared, "You have branded my daughters, so I will brand you." Sylvia was forced to be stripped naked, tied down, and gagged while one of Baniszewski's children heated a sewing needle with a series of matches. When the needle was orange, Gertrude used it to carve and burn the letter I and part of the letter M into Sylvia's stomach. She then instructed Ricky Hobbs to continue carving letters to spell out the phrase, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it." At one point, Hobbs stopped and asking Gertrude in a confused manner to spell prostitute for him. Baniszewski wrote it down on a piece of paper for him. When the process was finished, the tattoo consisted not only of the actual carving, but third-degree burns left behind by the heat of the needle. Sylvia's injury was so bad that modern plastic surgery would not have been able to correct it. Satisfied, Gertrude left the room, leaving Sylvia tied, gagged, and naked. At this point, Ricky, Paula, and Gertrude's 10-year-old daughter Shirley decided to give Sylvia another tattoo, an S in the middle of her chest. The three would later become confused as to whether they had intended the S to stand for Sylvia or slave. Ricky burned the bottom curve of the S into Sylvia. Shirley finished the job, but accidentally carved the curve backwards, so the numeral 3 appeared on Likens' chest. Gertrude re-entered the room at this point to address the still bound and gagged Sylvia. "What are you going to do now, Sylvia? You can't get married now. You can't get dressed in front of anyone. What are you going to do now?" Sylvia was ungagged to address Baniszewski. She replied, "I guess there's nothing I can do. It's on there." Roy Hubbard then took Sylvia back to the basement, where he used her for judo practice. In the middle of the night, Jenny Likens sneaked into the basement to visit her sister, where Sylvia told her, "I'm going to die, I can tell." Shortly after Jenny's visit, Gertrude inexplicably went into the basement and brought Sylvia upstairs and allowed her to sleep in one of the beds. She was allowed to sleep until noon of the next day, October 23rd, when Gertrude awoke her. Once Sylvia was awake, she and Stephanie took her into the bathroom and gave her a warm, soapy bath. After the bath, Gertrude and Paula addressed Sylvia and then dictated a letter to her, intended to look like a runaway letter to her parents. After Sylvia finished the letter, Gertrude began formulating a plan to have John Jr. and Jenny take Sylvia to a nearby garbage dump and leave her there to die. When Sylvia overheard this, she ran for the front door. but her emaciated, mutilated state moved so slowly that Gertrude was able to grab her just as she reached the front door and drag her back into the house. Once Gertrude settled Sylvia down, she took her into the kitchen and made her some toast. Sylvia attempted to eat it, but she said she couldn't swallow. Gertrude took down the curtain rod in the kitchen and beat Sylvia in the mouth with it. John then took Sylvia into the basement and tied her up, where Gertrude prepared a plate of crackers for Sylvia. When she offered the crackers to Sylvia, Sylvia replied, "Feed it to the dog. It's hungrier than I am." She then repeatedly punched Sylvia in the stomach before leaving her in the basement. On the next day, October 24th, Gertrude came into the basement and attempted to bludgeon Sylvia. First she tried to hit her with a chair, but missed and broke it against the wall. Next she tried to beat her over the head with a paddle, but swung in such a wide arc that it came back against her own face, blackening her eye. To stop the strange show, Corey Hubbard stepped in and beat Sylvia unconscious with a broomstick. Over the course of that night and into the morning hours of October 25th, Sylvia beat the basement floor with the screw portion of an iron shovel. Next-door neighbors would later report considering calling the police, but chose not to. On the morning of October 26th, Sylvia was unable to speak intelligibly or coordinate the movement of her limbs correctly. She was told to come upstairs, but collapsed before she could reach the stairs due to being too weak. Gertrude then went into the basement and stomped on Sylvia's head. Gertie then said it was bath time for Sylvia. Stephanie and Ricky brought Sylvia upstairs and laid her to the tub fully clothed. Once Stephanie realized that Sylvia had stopped breathing, she attempted to apply mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Gertie started yelling and accusing Sylvia of faking her own death. She began hitting Sylvia all over her body with a book, yelling, "Fake her, fake her." At the same time, her daughter was trying to bring Sylvia back to life, but it was too late. Sylvia was already dead. Gertrude instructed her children to take Sylvia's body to the basement and strip it naked. She then told Hobbs to go to the nearby payphone and call the police. The police arrived at 6:30 p.m., and Gertrude led the officers to Sylvia's body, lying on a soiled mattress in one of the bedrooms. Gertrude proceeded to lie to the officers, saying she tried everything she could to care for Sylvia before she died, and she said Likens was a troubled child and ran away with a group of unknown boys and became sexually active with the boys. Gertrude gave them letters she made Sylvia dictate as proof. In the midst of the commotion, Jenny Likens whispered to one of the police officers, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The statement that Jenny provided instructed police to arrest Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Baniszewski Jr. on suspicion of Sylvia's murder within hours of discovering Sylvia's body. The same day, Corey Hubbard and Richard Hobbs were also arrested and charged with the same offenses. They were held without bail. Meanwhile, an autopsy of Sylvia Likens turned up over 100 cigarette burns on her body, in addition to various second and third degree burns, severe bruising, and muscle and nerve damage. In her death throes, Sylvia bit through her lips, nearly severing each of them. Her vaginal cavity was nearly swollen shut, although an examination of the canal determined that her hymen was still intact, along with a lack of any ripping or tearing to the rectum, largely discrediting Gertrude's assertion that Sylvia was a prostitute and pregnant. The official cause of death was brain swelling, internal hemorrhaging of the brain, and shock. The prosecution sought the death penalty for all involved, including John and Hobbs, who were 13 and 14 at the time. Stephanie's lawyer got her a separate trial. Before it was able to begin, the district attorney dropped the murder charges. The case of the state of Indiana versus Gertrude, John, and Paula Baniszewski, Ricky Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard commenced in May of 1966. There were 4 lawyers, one for Baniszewski, one for Paula, one for Hobbs, and one for Coy and John, all of whom worked against each other and attempted to shift the blame against the other defendants, even though they were all being tried together. Baniszewski's attorney attempted to shift the blame onto the children. The children's attorney attempted to shift the blame onto Baniszewski and the other children. The most damaging testimony against Gertrude was due to her own self-incrimination. She recounted bizarre tales of Sylvia Likens being a neighborhood prostitute and of her trysts with middle-aged married men, as well as accusing her of frequently starting fights in the home. To corroborate Baniszewski's testimony, 11-year-old Marie was called to the stand. Initially, Marie backed everything her mother had said, until during cross-examination she suddenly screamed, "God help me," before admitting everything she had said was a lie, and went on to recount in graphic, blunt detail how her mother and siblings had tortured and murdered Sylvia. The young girl's shocking turn against her own family was largely responsible for the eventual verdict. Gertrude was found guilty of murder in the first degree. To the shock of the citizens of Indianapolis, she did not receive the death penalty, but rather life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Paula Baniszewski was convicted of second-degree murder. She appealed and was granted a new trial, but before it began she struck a plea bargain and pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter. She served 3 years in prison and then was paroled. John Baniszewski, Hubbard, and Hobbs were each convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 18 months in a juvenile detention facility. By the time the now 17-year-old Ricky Hobbs was released, the severity of his crimes had sunk in and he had suffered a nervous breakdown. He had begun a regime of heavy chain smoking which had severely decayed his lungs by the time he was 20. By the time he was 21, he was dead of lung cancer. Baniszewski appealed, was granted a new trial, and was again found guilty, though this time she was sentenced to 18 years to life. She was a model prisoner and earned the prison nickname Mom. She was up for parole in 1985. The news of Baniszewski's parole hearing sent shockwaves to the Indiana community. A petition with 4,500 signatures from the citizens of Indiana demanding that Baniszewski be kept behind bars was given to the parole board. In spite of all this, Baniszewski was granted parole. During the hearing, she gave the following confession. "I'm not sure what role I had in it, because I was on drugs. I never really knew her. I take full responsibility for whatever happened to Sylvia." Gertrude Baniszewski walked out of prison on December 4, 1985, and traveled to Iowa under the name Nadine Van Fossum. She died there of lung cancer in 1990.
I'm just asking for mercy, nothing else. I did never beat that girl. Never. She was beat up on by other girls. In fact, my own daughter socked her in the jaw and broke her wrist.
Welcome to my channel. This is Mr. Scary. Hope you enjoy the show.